Some Hawaiians believed hidden people were still living in these valleys, watching from places nobody could reach. Not spirits. Not monsters. Something far more unsettling than that. Small people said to move through forests at night, building massive structures before sunrise and disappearing before anyone could see them clearly. Ancient Hawaiians called them the Menehune. And what makes these stories difficult to dismiss completely is that they were never spoken about like harmless fairy tales. They were treated seriously, as if these hidden people once existed alongside ordinary society, remaining separate, secretive, and impossible to fully approach. Even today, people in Hawaii still lower their voices slightly when discussing certain valleys, forests, and ancient structures connected to the stories. And that's where the tension begins. Because most legends weaken once modern life arrives. Roads appear. Cities expand. Mystery fades. But the stories surrounding the Menehune survived. And when a belief survives across generations while remaining attached to real places people can still visit today, the question becomes difficult to ignore. Were the Menehune only mythology, or did something real exist at the center of the legend long before history became clear? Across the Hawaiian Islands, certain locations repeatedly appear in connection with stories about the Menehune: hidden valleys swallowed by dense rainforest, isolated mountains where visibility disappears beneath mist, remote cliffs and forests where the environment itself creates separation from ordinary life. And that detail matters more than most people realize. Because these stories were never centered in crowded villages or open coastlines where people moved freely after sunset. They belonged to places people naturally avoided at night. Valleys where sound traveled strangely through thick vegetation. Forest paths where visibility collapsed after only a few steps. Places where torchlight disappeared quickly into darkness and movement beyond the trees became impossible to track clearly. And throughout human history, isolated landscapes often become attached to mystery because environments that limit visibility also limit certainty. But in Hawaii, the stories surrounding the Menehune became unusually specific. They were not described as ghosts floating outside reality. They were described as hidden inhabitants, small in stature, physically powerful, highly intelligent, and capable of engineering structures impossible to complete overnight by ordinary labor. Fishponds. Irrigation systems. Stone walls. Entire pathways said to appear between sunset and sunrise. And this is where the tension deepens. Because some of those structures still exist today. Ancient fishponds tied directly to oral traditions claiming the Menehune built them in a single night. Massive stonework standing in places where the environment itself makes construction difficult even now. And once visible evidence becomes attached to a legend, the emotional effect changes completely. The story no longer feels safely imaginary. It begins occupying an uncomfortable space between folklore and possibility. And over time, the islands themselves started protecting that feeling. Mist drifting through valleys before dawn. Stories of torchlight moving deep in forests after midnight. Places where people refused to travel alone after sunset because the environment itself felt occupied by something unseen. And maybe that's why the stories survived so long. Because the land itself still feels capable of hiding something. What separates the Menehune from ordinary mythology is how emotionally grounded the stories feel. Ancient Hawaiians did not describe them like magical creatures detached from reality. They described them like another hidden society existing beside ordinary human life, close enough to leave traces behind, but distant enough to avoid direct contact. According to tradition, the Menehune worked mostly at night, moving through forests and valleys while the rest of the island slept. Entire fishponds were said to appear by sunrise. Stone walls completed before dawn. Some structures were considered so advanced and labor-intensive that people refused to believe ordinary workers could have completed them that quickly. And if anyone tried watching the Menehune directly, the work would immediately stop and remain unfinished forever. And that detail changes the emotional tone of the story completely. Because this was not a legend about monsters attacking villages or spirits haunting forests. It was a story about hidden intelligence operating just beyond visibility. Watching. Building. Remaining separate from ordinary society while occasionally leaving evidence behind. And that creates a much deeper psychological tension. Because throughout history, isolated islands often preserve fragmented memories of earlier populations, displaced communities, or groups forced into hiding after later arrivals changed the balance of society. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Menehune legend did not begin as fantasy at all? What if it began as memory? And once that possibility enters the story, everything changes. Because now the question stops being whether tiny magical beings existed in Hawaii. The question becomes whether ancient Hawaiians preserved fading memories of real hidden people through oral tradition over centuries. And that explanation becomes difficult to dismiss completely because the stories remain surprisingly consistent across generations. Hidden builders. Isolated valleys. Night activity. Separate communities existing just beyond visibility. Those are not random fantasy elements. They resemble the way real isolated populations are often remembered once historical clarity begins disappearing with time. And this is where the story stops feeling like harmless folklore. Because structures connected to the Menehune legend still exist in Hawaii today. Ancient fishponds. Massive stone walls. Irrigation systems. Engineering projects tied directly to oral traditions claiming they were completed overnight by hidden builders. And this is where it stops making sense in an ordinary way, because once physical structures become attached to a legend, separating mythology from history becomes far more complicated. Some of these sites required enormous coordination and labor. The kind of work difficult to complete quickly even with organized planning. And that's exactly why the stories survived. Because people standing before those structures generations later naturally asked the same question: who built this? And when uncertainty enters history, legends rush in to fill the space. Some historians argue the Menehune stories became symbolic explanations attached later to engineering achievements whose original creators faded from memory over time. Others believe the legends may preserve distorted memories of earlier inhabitants who disappeared into isolated areas after social changes reshaped Hawaiian society. And that second explanation is what keeps the mystery alive. Because stories about hidden people appear repeatedly across human history, especially in regions where traces of older populations survive after their identity begins fading from collective memory. And if something similar happened in Hawaii, then the Menehune legend may not be mythology in the way most people imagine. It may be something much more unsettling, a cultural echo. Fragments of real memory transformed slowly into folklore until the original truth became impossible to separate completely from imagination. And that possibility changes the emotional weight of the entire story. Because now the Menehune stop feeling like fantasy creatures, and start feeling like forgotten people history slowly concealed behind myth. What makes the Menehune legend especially powerful is that it survived modernization almost untouched emotionally. Normally, once roads, tourism, technology, and urban development reshape a place, older mysteries begin collapsing under visibility. The unknown becomes mapped. Isolation disappears. Atmosphere weakens. But Hawaii resisted that completely. Even today, the islands still contain valleys difficult to enter after dark, forests capable of swallowing sound within minutes, cliffs hidden beneath mist where the environment itself feels larger than human control. And those landscapes matter because they continue reinforcing the emotional conditions that allowed the stories to survive in the first place. Humans are psychologically vulnerable to places where visibility becomes uncertain. Environments where movement disappears quickly into darkness naturally trigger tension because the brain begins imagining what cannot be clearly seen. And the Menehune legend fits perfectly inside that emotional space. Hidden people. Watching from forests. Working beyond visibility. Remaining close enough to leave traces behind while avoiding direct contact completely. The story survives because the islands themselves still feel capable of hiding something. And maybe that's why certain valleys developed reputations people avoided after sunset. Not because anyone proved something dangerous existed there, but because the atmosphere itself became difficult to ignore. Even now, hikers moving through isolated Hawaiian forests sometimes describe sudden silence, strange emotional heaviness, or the uncomfortable sensation of being observed despite complete visual emptiness. And whether those reactions come from instinct, suggestion, or imagination almost becomes secondary. Because the emotional result remains the same. The landscape itself continues protecting the mystery. So were the Menehune real? One explanation is simple, that they are entirely mythological figures created to explain ancient structures and preserve Hawaiian storytelling traditions. But that explanation does not fully remove the tension. Because the consistency of the stories, the repeated descriptions of hidden builders living apart from society, and the physical locations attached directly to the legend all suggest something more grounded than ordinary fantasy. The other possibility is harder to define, and far more unsettling. That the legend preserved fragmented memories of real inhabitants whose identity slowly disappeared beneath centuries of retelling until history and mythology became impossible to separate cleanly. And if that's true, then the Menehune were never magical creatures at all. They were echoes of forgotten people transformed gradually into legend as the original truth faded across generations. And that possibility is what keeps the story alive. Not proof. Not evidence. But the uncomfortable space between memory and myth. Because sometimes legends survive not because they were invented, but because something real existed at their center long before written history arrived. And maybe that's why some people still lower their voices when they talk about the Menehune. Because deep in certain Hawaiian valleys, where mist moves silently through dense forest and visibility disappears beyond a few feet, the idea still feels just possible enough to remain unsettling. And maybe that discomfort is exactly why the legend never disappeared completely. Some legends survive because they entertain people. And some survive because something about them never feels completely gone. And if this made you question how much history may still exist hidden beneath myth, you're not the only one thinking it. And you're in the right place. Join us next time. Tilt and chill. Stay curious.